Have you ever just been enjoying a new world, became besties with the resurrected form of the father of the first brood, explored the remains of an unearthed technological monument with the descendants of an ancient royal bloodline, ever been framed for the unaliving of a reigning monarch during a government coup? If you've been affected by or experienced any of these, then you're in the right place. Welcome back to Sprout Talk for Final Fantasy XIV Patches 2.1 to 2.5. So the MSQ for these patches are really interesting because right away the status quo with the Scions and the Warrior Light gets mixed up. You're thrusted into this new era and immediately the question of where your place in all this is and whether or not the Scions can actually remain independent in the political structure of Eorzea and if that was the right decision to take. And that's the intro into post ARR because it allows a pseudo clean state for not only the game but also the player. And it's a good thing that 2.1 has a decently strong premise for this new phase because unfortunately a necessary evil of having to be a setup patch is ultimately what we end up with here. But it's not just a setup for everything leading to Heaven's War because for whatever reason there's a name drop for a subplot all the way in Stormblood, which at this point in time as of release was about 4 or 5 years away. And that was an odd choice for me because it's sprinkled out between all of these patches and the earliest payoff is post Heaven's War.
Pray return to the point.
But back on track, we get introduced to the core cast of characters of these patches, and they range from cocky little prick to small slimy elitists and Minphilia's mum for some reason. Actually, no, there is a reason she tells Minphilia to move to Revenant's Toll. So it's nice to know having zero character runs in this family. But ultimately, 2.1 feels more like a series of vignettes in how it's presented, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but with everything being set up and introduced, it's at least got a decent flow to it. These next two patches are slightly odd because while I fully understand releasing Leviathan in ARR after the 2011 floods in Japan wouldn't have had good optics on it, but I'm not sure why Ramuh wasn't part of 2.0. If there was a reason for it, I'm unaware, but I feel like this should have been in the base game. But with that being said, these two patches do a lot of good work with characters, especially for Melvib and Kanisana, to keep them on the same level as Nanamo since she's the leader that's getting the focus of the post-ARR MSQ. So I'm not going to complain too much that these are here as they serve their purpose, so I appreciate that we have these here now. I just wish like this video that they were combined into one so that the main plot of the MSQ got a bit more time to itself. But we're at the halfway point for these patches and it's full speed straight into the revolution and the classism and the racism that's plaguing Ul'dah and at the centre of it. A property developer who wants a new weapon found in the ground that's stronger than Bahamut? Who's shocked? But now it's time for a slight distraction as we are now back to the Ascians. But this time we get a lesson on Ether with Minphilia, which is presented in a lovely little PowerPoint. And it's an exposition dump really that wasn't necessarily needed, at least not right now. But I appreciate it all the same, even though I do feel like this should have been part of 2.1 since it's set up, but I get that this is here to pad out quest. But there is one thing that these patches do really well, better than anything before it. The cutscenes, they are such a noticeable step up, and with that, the character development and just having Leviathan and Ramuh in the game finally stops these two patches in particular being total duds. So overall, it's a decent couple of patches for the MSQ. I just wish that ultimately it had a bit more focus on the actual big problem at hand, because we're running headfirst towards the end, and up next is another distraction, but this time it's not a complete distraction as we have Alphinaud's private police armada, the Crystal Braves, being made official. And for their first big assignment, the heretic cult from Ishgard led by Lady Iceheart. Now this worked really well for the official introduction of Ishgard for me, and we naturally get some more characters and they're all immediately interesting. Maybe it's the Dragoon bias in me, but there was just something about these guys, especially Aymeric. This dude is just cool, right? He looks cool, he acts cool, and he puts Alphinaud in his place at the first opportunity. So for me, he's a win. But it wouldn't be Final Fantasy XIV without the Ascians, and of course they're pulling the strings in Ishgard, so at least we have that to look forward to. But this patch is just stuffed to the brim with plot, right? Character development, the world building, it's exactly what I've been waiting for this entire time. But if anyone at this point in the game is feeling burnt out, this isn't enough to get you to carry on to see where all the hype goes and what everything's about. I don't know what will be. And even with all of that, they somehow managed to introduce yet another character, and one of their best so far in Moonbreeder. Her dynamic with the Scions, especially Eorzea, is great. She's a much needed personality injection for that entire group. And in complete contrast to the last part, I wish this was split into two because there is just so much going on and it gets slightly underserved because of it. And I haven't even mentioned the resurrection of Midgardsormr as a subplot and the main reason for Ishgard getting involved all of a sudden. There's just so much in this patch, it's basically an expansion in itself, and I just hope that nothing goes wrong for anyone because that would be devastating. So, reach the big one, the final update leading to Heavensward, and it does not disappoint in the slightest. But it does get this slightly weird railroading of each plot as they all start to wrap up, and then it's on to the next wrap up, and then it's this daisy chain of clusterfucks, and it's not a bad thing inherently, as something going wrong all at once is a valid narrative choice. It's just sometimes it doesn't give these things time to breathe, and that happens here slightly. For example, we have Minfilia questioning her own choices, but then it's immediately onto the crystal braids being corrupt, and then you're suddenly fighting dragons on the steps of Ishgard before being framed for the murder of the reigning monarch. And from an immersion standpoint, it does a good job at making your head spin along with the characters, but just a few moments to breathe between each one would have been really welcomed here. But one thing I really did enjoy is them bringing Estinian back. Obviously, as a Dragoon main and having done the job quest, this is a reintroduction to the character for me, and not a full first time meeting. So I enjoyed the callback to that. Now for this next part, I'm going to take the side of Natsuko Ishikawa here, the woman that wrote Moonbreeder in the previous patches. But killing that character off was a mistake. There was so much potential here and they just throw it all away. Like, don't get me wrong, it's a good way to go out. It was well written, it was done well, the cutscene was fantastic. It just didn't need to happen here this soon. This could have been in Shadowbringers, but maybe it happened because it would have been one too many Scions. I don't know, but she was wasted in the end of this. But after that, the MSQ absolutely pops off as the writers nail the landing for the Heavensward lead up, with events that I didn't personally see coming. Like, sure, the crystal braids being corrupted, that's obvious, right? If anyone trusted Ilberd or one of them damn Lalafels, I don't know what to tell you, you're just a bad judge of character. But I honestly wasn't expecting this level of fallout, because we leave this patch and everything else with it in chaos. You don't know where you are, who's alive and who's on your side. Nanamo is dead, Raban has been crippled, the Scions are apparently all dead as well, and you're just left with Alpha Node, who's about to have a breakdown of his own, and the only thing you can do really now is head off to Ishgard. So ultimately, at the end of all these patches, I loved it. I thought it was phenomenal storytelling, and it quite honestly doesn't stop there. Yes, it's finally time to talk about the Crystal Tower, and I am so glad that they decided to make this mandatory. But the placing of it isn't ideal. I'd really like to know why the game forces you to hard stop the MSQ to do what is actually side content as everything is kicking off. Like, sure, it can't be forced afterwards because the pacing there would be far worse, but we could have done this before 2.5 released. I feel like that's the better spot for it, because this absolutely deserves its own time in the spotlight, and right now where it is, everything gets done in a disservice. Now obviously that could just be me, I'm not sure if you're able to do the entire raid questline beforehand or not, but for the sake of those like me that don't know, it shouldn't have been where it is. If you can do the whole thing before, I'd highly recommend doing that instead of running into the hard lockout wall. But with all that being said, this entire questline is fantastic. Learning more about the Allagans and their technology and the royal bloodline and how the Crystal Tower remained hidden until the Calamity is the type of lore dump that I've always been here for, and it really helps that all the characters introduced and reintroduced, in Nero's case as a foil to Cid, and that makes everyone in this really compelling and all have really nice arcs to round it out. The actual raids themselves are a really fun experience. My only complaint, and it's not even really a complaint, it's more of a regret, just like I had with the Coils of Bahamut, because obviously this is now 11-year-old content, so it's been power crept into nothing, and unless you get 24 Sprouts, which is highly unlikely, everyone already knows the mechanics. But even then, the power creep means you don't even have to think about the mechanics, because most things are just over in minutes. But I think I had the typical Sprout experience where everyone was super nice and understanding if I made a mistake, which is such a stark contrast to Destiny raids, where everyone's on edge and it's intimidating in LFG because no one really wants to give you the time to learn, whereas here people understand and respect that you're new. So overall, I had so much fun with these raids and the questline as a whole that I actually look forward to seeing it inevitably show up in the Duty Finder. So while we're talking about the raids, I touched on this in the first Sprout talk for base ARR 2.0, which you can find in the top corner, but the Coils of Bahamut are unfortunately something that isn't in the duty finder, and once I unsynced them and just plowed on through, I can understand why, because even being super over leveled for these and not at the item level for the raid, these encounters can have such complex mechanics in them, and seeing other new players do them the way that it was intended is actually insane. But despite the regret that I'll probably never get to have a full proper experience of Coils, as I said previously, I'm still glad that I've done it, because seeing the actual ending to A Realm Reborn was really nice, and the Bahamut encounter is absolutely my favourite. The design of that fight and the musical cues is Final Fantasy firing on all cylinders, and coupled with the narrative and emotional payoff, it's generally one of my favourite moments in the entire franchise. But since we're on the subject of Endgame, let me just say, I never want to see a damn book in this game ever again. I can honestly say that I'm never doing another A Realm Reborn Relic because that was rough. I know I said last time, but to round out this part of the Sprout talk, I want to just say how surprised, shock I know that's the theme of this video, I was at just how enjoyable the start of the Relics quest was. But goddamn, that went immediately south once those first two steps were done. But I will say, like last time, it was absolutely worth it in the end, because this is genuinely top 5 weapon glams for any job. That they just go so hard. So with that, I think it's safe to say I've had enough of Fate farming and Aurum Vale. Definitely Aurum Vale, that is absolutely a dungeon of all time. But speaking of dungeons, they're also interesting in these patches, right? Because you can really feel that CBU3's finding their feet on exactly how they want dungeons to work, and you get some really interesting and creative ideas from like one room to the next in every single dungeon. Even the trials as well. My personal favourite is the Battle on the Big Bridge from the Hildebrand questline, which, by the way, huge fan of. Great change of pace, it's really well written, and the comedic timing is on point. But the first trial works so well, and that's purely because of Greg. Greg's been a personal favourite of mine since the beginning, and the music for that never misses. That theme is perfect no matter how many renditions they make of it. So to wrap these patches up, I don't want to say that they saved my experience of this game, because that just wouldn't be true. I really enjoyed base 2.0, but the jump in quality here was amazing. It feels special to be able to see in real time developers grow and figure everything out as they go along. And sure, my experience differs wildly from the original state of these patches, because there's been some fat trimming, and while there's still a lot of quests here to get to Heaven's Ward, it's basically a whole other expansion, right? I do think they could afford to cut some more out, but not too many, as what we have left is still really good. And I also wouldn't want them to mess with the narrative, because as it is now, this holds up the introduction to the entire game and sets the tone fantastically. Though I am curious as to what exactly was cut out, but that's something I can find out on my own time. But with that and the endgame offerings, that they've been some of my favourites, and not just for Final Fantasy XIV, but for Final Fantasy as a whole. And I'm just still so thankful that this game exists. But yet again, everyone, we've reached the end of another Sprout talk. Hopefully you all enjoyed as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, you can look forward to Heaven's Ward next, covering all of base 3.0. So if you haven't already, leave a like and a comment for the algorithm. Tell me about your experience with these patches. How did you get on with them? Did you like them? Did you not? If not, just leave Ishgard in the comments to let me know that you made it this far, and stay tuned to the channel by subscribing, because did you know that statistically 95% of you who watched the first Sprout talk weren't subbed? So let's try and bring those numbers down and grow this community. And as always, I've been Mitch692, you've been great, and this has been another Sprout talk, so peace.